Welcome to the Fantasy Source Baseball Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, sitting here with Matt Lutovsky. Tuesday, Brad and I talked about how there were several hitters that were doing very well or especially poorly in the month of June, and Brad illustrated some of the reasons why you might buy or sell on those guys, or at least your opinion on them, why they might be higher or lower, looking at their peripheral stats. Well, same thing today with Matt, except we're going to be talking about pitchers. One of the interesting things that I think Brad said in that last podcast was that the calendar does not determine your stats. It's a nice organizational tool to get a snapshot, but if you can trick yourself into seeing guys as something that they're not if you only look at their month-to-month stats.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you always have to take into account the bigger picture, and something we'll talk about a little bit too is even within a month, you take into account the first half of the month, the second half, for pitchers especially, because a couple good starts here and the way that can go. But I do think looking at these June stats, for some of the top pitchers in June, yield some interesting guys. The number one pitcher in terms of ERA was Cliff Lee. He was, fantastic, and he's a great pitcher, so you just kind of chalk that up to him being a great pitcher. But number two on that list, Jordan Zimmerman. And that's where things get a little interesting. He had a .5, or so far, has a .5 ERA in June. And 0.85, I'm sorry. And but his K per 9 ratio, 5.74, not that great. And he's not walking guys, that's the key, and he's not giving up homers. And so as long as he does that, he can still be a very good fantasy pitcher, but he's not an elite fantasy pitcher until he gets that K rate up quite a bit.
Now, the interesting thing about Zimmerman, and we'll see this as we go down the list of these guys that are doing very, very well, he leaves a ton of guys on base, 91% left on base percentage according to Fangraphs, and then also the home run to fly ball percentage. Normally it hovers around 11% on average in the league. 2.1% of the fly balls that he's given up have been home runs, which in some ways, some people will contend that might be a little bit of skill. He might be not letting guys hit the ball quite as hard. But a lot of other people will also say that that's just a matter of some balls catching a breeze going back in towards the infield as opposed to the outfield.
Or, and you also have to take into account matchups he had this month, which I don't know off the top of my head, but, things like that will play into it too, which parts he's pitching in. But he's a guy who I like, but I don't like as an elite pitcher, which really has kind of been what he's been this month because he's kept his ERA so low. But you go down the list a little more, you see Verlander, great. We know he's great. Just insane how well he's pitching. And the fourth lowest starter's ERA in June is Jeff Karstens.
I mean, I think he's a reliever in MLB The Show.
Right. And the thing about Karstens that's so interesting is that, once again, like a lot of these top guys, very low walk rate, which is great. Which is definitely a good thing. He's striking out his K per 9 3.41.
So he's totally relying on his defense.
Yeah, I mean, if 175 batting average on balls in play, that won't continue. 94.3 left on base percentage. So obviously the relievers cleaning up for him are doing are helping. In addition to him helping himself, he's not really giving up homers. But that's something that, if you picked up Karstens and you've been kind of riding him and getting some quality innings from him, like at the back end of your rotation in a mixed league, you can't count on that continuing.
Oh, yeah, you don't give those stats back. You love that you got those stats, but you cannot count on it moving forward. And if someone gave you any kind of reasonable offer, would you say jump on it?
Yes, absolutely. He's the kind of guy I think you move. And I would also throw another guy who's high on this list, Carlos Carrasco, in that group. He's a good pitcher. I think his talent level is better than Jeff Karstens, and he's good, and he's been very good this month. But again, 5.91 K per 9 ratio, a 216 batting average on balls in play. I mean, those are numbers that are going to even out. And the K per 9 ratio isn't great. And again, not walking guys, so that's good. You think, okay, he can keep his whip pretty low if he doesn't walk guys, but not a guy you can really count on for the long term.
Yeah, and he's not even really a keeper candidate in most leagues either, unless you're talking about the deeper dynasty leagues.
Right, yeah, you get deep. Now, a guy I do really like who basically has no name value. Chalk it up to pitching on the West Coast, chalk it up to whatever you want, but Tim Stauffer. And he's pitched I mean, really well this month. For the majority of the season, he's pitched well. Yeah, he had a little rough patch in May.
I think he's also discounted because he's in Petco. And, like, for fantasy purposes, everyone thinks, yeah, you want a Padres pitcher. But on top of that, he's doing very well.
Well, the big numbers for him, we've been talking about K per 9 ratio, walk per 9 ratio, 1.76 base on balls per 9, which is great. But then the 8.12 strikeout per 9, which is, is not like Verlander level or anything like that, but it's very good. It's very solid, and if he can continue to do that, I think you're going to see him really be a solid mixed league pitcher for the rest of the year.
It's almost an indication that if he has that kind of stuff to get those strikeouts, that the 250 batting average on balls in play is more real than the batting average on balls in play that, say, Carrasco has been given.
And throw in, too, in June, 53.2% ground ball percentage.
Exactly.
Which is very solid.
On top of that, I mean, if he's a ground ball pitcher getting that number of strikeouts, we're talking about vintage Brandon Webb.
Well, and that's why I like another guy who's high on this list, Johnny Cueto, who his K per 9 isn't as good, I think, as people think it is sometimes. I think we kind of tend to view Cueto as a strikeout guy because, remember, his very first start of his career, he had like 9 in 5 innings or something crazy. But, his 7.07 strikeout per 9, good, not great, but very good. But not walking a lot of guys, just over 2 on the walks per 9, and then 60.4% ground ball. So that's, he pitches in a bad ballpark. So him keeping the ball on the ground is huge. And I really like him this year. Like, he will regress. Like, he's not going to keep, sub-2 ERA, of course. But I really think he's kind of breaking out, and not breaking out the way we thought he would a couple years ago, but breaking out nonetheless, and is developed into a really fine mixed league pitcher.
What about some of the guys who have really high ERAs in the past month that you think that, that ERA is, well, I'll just say it, just an illusion, and that they've actually pitched much better than that?
Well, the big one there, and second month in a row we've talked about him for this, so you're starting to, there's a trend there, but Zach Greinke. 6.04 ERA in June, but a fielding independent pitching of 2.69, an 11.12 K per 9 ratio, 1.91 walks per 9 ratio.
You're talking about Verlander-esque.
Right. So why is his ERA above 6? I can't figure it out. His home runs, even his home runs were down. He was giving up less than a homer per 9, but still a little high. But we see a 350 batting average on balls in play, not leaving anyone on base. 51.7 left on base percentage, which, just as a point of comparison, Jordan Zimmerman was 91.1.
Right.
Those are going to even out, and if he can keep up that strikeout to walk ratio, which he's done now for as long as he's been pitching this season.
So whatever you do not sell low on Zach Greinke.
Absolutely, and he's the kind of guy that I would be going after. Every day.
You may have taken a bath on him already, but the rest of the season, he's going to get way better.
Right, and the strikeouts are there. It's not like you're asking him to improve across the board.
Right.
The strikeouts are there, but another interesting guy on this list, struggled in June, is Josh Tomlin, and everyone knew he was going to come back to earth. He was so good early in the year. But what's interesting about him, and this is what I was saying before about not all, you can't just look at a month. He's pitched well his last 3 starts after a really poor beginning to June. And the amazing stat with him, 0.49. 0.49.
0.49.
Walks per 9 innings. Like, that's insanely good. And he can help you in whip. Like, he's the kind of guy who will have that 5 earned runs and 5 base runners. Like, he'll somehow do that. But he will help you in whip, and he's a guy who I'm kind of back on his bandwagon as a back-end mixed league starter.
Like, we like high strikeout per 9 ratings,
right.
And his 5.84 is
not great.
Not great, but when you pair it with that 0.49 walks per 9, and again, that'll come up a little bit, but even if he goes 5-1,
right.
4-1, that's reasonable and reason to think moving forward he's going to be solid, and that ERA that jumped up to, 6.04? Something like that's 5.84?
Yeah, 5.84.
5.84 in June. That'll come down because, that kind of strikeout to walk ratio.
He's interesting solid. Because he's like Alexio Gondo, who also struggled a little recently in that all year their fielding independent pitching has said these guys aren't this good. These guys are going to regress major. But in June, both their fielding independents were much better than their ERA. So the true value is somewhere in between, and that makes them decent mixed league starters.
Can we also point out that the patron saint of great peripherals and poor results is on this list?
Yeah, go ahead.
Javier Vazquez.
That's right. He is having... I'm gonna just be 100% honest. I do not like Javier Vazquez. But 8.42 K per 9, 1.74 walks per 9, those are really good numbers. There's no getting around it. And yeah, 3.75 fielding, independent pitching to go with a 5.52 ERA says he's been pretty good this month, and he's at least in the discussion now, being fantasy relevant again, as much as I hate to say that. But he is, and good home ballpark, and if he can keep striking guys out, he's going to have fantasy value.
Now, as I said, I joked about him being the patron saint of this, but the thing about him is that much like his teammate Anibal Sanchez, he's done this for years beforehand. Yeah. Like he's had top end fantasy seasons, but also previously he's had something like 4 or 5 seasons where all the peripherals came together and he still ended up with a 5 ERA.
Yeah, and I think too with him it comes down to homers, and that's something that he gives up. He's still giving up homers, and if you do that, you're going to have a high ERA. And it's going to cost you. But, his biggest thing the past year and a half is that his strikeout pitches disappeared, his velocity has disappeared. Well, he's striking guys out again. And if he can do that, he'll have value. Like, by hook or by crook, he'll have value.
All right, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
All right.